All right. What the Minnesota Timberwolves did to the Denver Nuggets tonight? Give me your facial expression with that. Okay, your turn. Give me something to react to.
Anthony Edwards falling on his back.
All right, the potential market for Jonas Valanciunas as a free agent center. All right, one more.
There being a game 7 of the series.
All right, let's get rolling here. Game 7 is going to happen in Minnesota versus Denver. You thought that Denver had control of the series. They had outclassed Minnesota for 3 straight games, leading for all but 1 minute of the second half in games 3 through 5. But au contraire, Mike Conley comes back from the dreaded soleus strain, and they completely destroyed the Nuggets. I mean, so badly that it's almost hard to analyze it. It seems like at some point Denver, early in the second half, just decided they were going to get ready for game 7. Ended up being a complete blowout in the end. I haven't even looked at what the final score is yet.
It's 115 to 70 because it was a 29-9 fourth quarter in favor of the Wolves.
And well, that's amazing, Danny, because 14 points in the first quarter was the fewest points Denver had scored all year, and they proceeded to score 9. I assume the starters didn't play at all in the fourth.
Correct.
I was just kind of watching the box score, basically,
or at least a significant portion of it. I mean, Julian Strawther got 9 minutes. That's a good proxy.
So let's talk about what took place here and what was the biggest thing other than, I mean, should we just talk about the presence of Conley? Do you think that was the biggest difference, or was it something
I don't. I think that was probably second biggest, though it was clearly important. And I think that it was Minnesota going to a different approach in part on Nikola Jokic. And Jokic had this unbelievable game 5 where Dan Feldman for Daily Dunks did a great job kind of putting it into context as one of the greatest individual single game offensive performances in postseason history. Not that we can compare apples to apples due to the lack of play-by-play data for some of the older stuff. And Denver, I'm sure they would have loved to for everything to go on exactly the same, but Minnesota changed things up. And one of the things that they did, and we saw it from the very beginning of this game, was they threw more consistent double teams at Jokic, and it really discombobulated the Nuggets in the early going.
Well, and the thing was, they double teamed, but they didn't do it with Gobert. They kept him roaming around. So they generally double teamed from the perimeter. And most of the time, I thought they double teamed either from the top or from the wing on any Jokic post-ups as they tried to go to that to kind of find themselves with Murray not really feeling it. And so the pass that was available was a pass for a 3-pointer. And they forced the Denver Nuggets to take more threes than they wanted to. And surely it helped that they missed those. But Denver likes to shoot, probably in the mid to high 20s in terms of number of 3-pointers per game. And they want to open up the rim. In game 5, 25 of 37 at the rim. In this game, 10 of 12 and only 4 of 6 in the first half, which I guess we'll generously consider the competitive portion of this one. So they double teamed. That prevented them from just getting totally killed by Jokic and his individual post-up game and his floater game. And then they also were able to kind of shut off the water to some of the other guys. Now, Murray Michael Porter Jr., those guys going to miss this many shots in a game 7? No, but they kind of did what we were calling for them to do because they were just getting so sliced up by Jokic that they decided to kind of go back to the idea of making Denver beat them from the outside, and that worked very well in this game.
It also, so yes, Denver taking and missing a lot more threes than one would expect. And in that first half, Denver was 5 of 21. And you brought up that they want to shoot in the mid 20s. Well, they were on pace for 42 at halftime. But also in the early going in particular, the shots that Denver was getting were not particularly good either. Like Jamal Murray's shot mix in the early going, he ended up a ghastly 4 of 18 from the field. He was 4 of 11 on, or sorry, 2 of 11 on twos and 2 of 7 on threes. His shot mix wasn't those wide open ones. Michael Porter Jr. definitely got some. KCP got a fair amount. Aaron Gordon got a fair amount. But the Nuggets weren't getting the most devastating stuff to them. And another way to measure that, in part because of the feedback loops, partially, was Denver was only credited with 7 fast break points in the first half of this game. And with I froze my clean the glass because I never updated it after halftime. And Denver's transition frequency in the first half was 4.1%. After that was so devastating at parts of game 5.
Yeah, and the only time they really got much in transition was when Minnesota kind of went through a jag of missing themselves. But Minnesota also gets, oh, this is fascinating, actually. Minnesota had 11 offensive rebounds at halftime and didn't have any in the second half. Is that right? But they didn't need them. They shot much better in the second half, too. But that was pretty key that they dominated the possession game. Minnesota only turned it over 4 times in the first half and 6 times total for the game. And certainly I thought Denver's effort level on the defensive end was nowhere where it needed to be, near where it needed to be. Jokic in particular, he's at his worst when teams are able to drive to the basket and he has to like rotate over and make a play. He's much better when teams are kind of going right at him. And so that sort of played into his worst aspects as a defender because the Nuggets are double teaming all over. Like they're just continuing to double team Anthony Edwards. They had success of that in his 5 of 15 game 5. In this one, Edwards got hot from 3 early. Also, they're able to just get out in transition because Denver goes, what did it end up being? Like 6 or 7 minutes without scoring at all on a 20-0 run in that first quarter. So that inevitably you're going to get some transition off of that. But I think ultimately Denver just lost heart because they weren't making shots. And we're just recording right afterwards. Yeah, go ahead.
This series has confounded at a lot of different turns, from Minnesota's dominance in the very early going to Denver completely responding back and everything else. And that happened even within this game where Minnesota scored the first 2 points. Then Denver went on a 9-0 run. You're like, oh, here we go again. You know, Porter Jr. got an open 3. Denver got some pretty good looks. Minnesota was missing shots that were kind of similar to the ones they got in game 5. Then it was a 29-5 run. And so basically Denver got their 9-0 run and it ended with 9:03 remaining in the first. And I didn't do the full numbers. This is just what I took in the contemporaneous notes. They then scored 15 points in 15 minutes after that start.
Yeah, and 0 for like 5 minutes. And
yep.
In the end, the game was pretty much over at that point. And I mean, that 3-point shooting was just so ghastly from them. They couldn't hit a mid-ranger either. But yeah, I thought that Minnesota, there's always the dance, right? Oh, are we going to double team Jokic? Are we going to let him have his cake and eat it too? Like that's what Charles Barkley said after game 5. Like, how does he have 40 points but also have 13 assists? Like, aren't you supposed to you're supposed to shut off one or the other? And a lot of that was stuff he was doing in transition in game 5 that, of course, they weren't getting it in this game. So, I mean, Minnesota's defense was great. Jaden McDaniels staying out of foul trouble for once was huge. He only had 1 foul, and then he also was able to
and that 1 foul was a horrendous call.
Yeah, and I thought he really was able to bother Porter Jr. They still, I mean, credit Anthony Edwards again, plus 43 in this game. He was fantastic in the first half offensively, but then he also was the main guy on Jamal Murray. And that enables them to put McDaniels on Michael Porter Jr. and really bother him some. Porter Jr. did miss some open ones, but McDaniels was really the guy who was on him most of the time, was bothering him from behind. They bring Porter Jr. off those screens and off those handoffs, and he's still able to kind of be behind and bother him. They try to run something between Murray and Porter Jr. Now you can switch that as well. And so they also got back to kind of letting Aaron Gordon shoot 3-pointers. And hey, he was 2 of 4, but it also wasn't a case where Rudy Gobert was just like daring him to shoot it. They'd throw it to him. They were leaving him open, but they would at least try to close him down. So it wasn't like he was just shooting batting practice threes. And it was just a wonderful defensive performance to double team as much as they did and also not give up anything at the rim. And of course, Gobert was a massive part of that. And I'm sure nobody is going to be talking about how amazing Rudy Gobert was in this game because they don't get it, but he was.
And in that first half, Denver only took 5 shots in the restricted area. They took 5 in the restricted area, 14 from the upper paint, 5 of 14 there, and then 1 of 4 from mid-ranger. So that's exactly what Denver doesn't want. They also weren't getting to the free throw line, 8 attempts and a half. That was not only, that's lower than you'd like, but also that was fewer than Minnesota's 12. And so Denver wasn't getting the shots they wanted. And there will be a lot of attention, justifiably so, on Denver missing their 3-pointers. Like overall in the game, they were 7 of 36. And in the first half, they were 4 of 21. Minnesota was only 5 of 21 during the first half as well. And they were just crushing them. And it was the 2-pointers. It was Minnesota getting the shots inside the arc. And something that transitioned from the first half to the second half, I appreciated it more in the early second half, was Minnesota taking advantage of the other thing Denver's doing. Denver did a fair amount of doubling. They also did a fair amount of switching. And Minnesota, Chris Finch and company, did a very nice job using the switching to get Karl Anthony Towns looks. There were times where they used it to do for Edwards as well. But get a small on Karl Anthony Towns. Karl Anthony Towns attacking quickly, not swinging his elbows around, and when he needed to, making a good pass. He had a couple of really nice passes to Gobert in particular.
Yeah, to the weak side, they were better finding Gobert too. You pointed this out, that we were critical of them in Game 5 for not finding Gobert enough on the alley-oops. I thought they looked for him enough in the first half on those. And then we haven't talked about Conley yet. Probably time to bring him in now.
Yeah.
He was actually pretty aggressive. He hit like a really tough 3 going to his left at one point, which you very rarely see. Usually he's going to go to his right on those shots. But he also just moved the ball so fast. Like his 5 assists really, I think, undercounts what he was able to do. Because as we noted, like Denver has done a lot of double teaming. And they gambled and were mostly correct over the last 3 games that Minnesota's passing and shooting as well wouldn't be good enough to beat that. And even the first half, they were getting wide open looks, but they were also getting some pretty good drives from the likes of McDaniels and Edwards. And I thought it was really good that Minnesota, either through Conley Gobert action or Towns posting up, they were able to get Ant doing a lot of his damage off of closeouts, where Denver's scheme, you can't just stick to Ant there. If you're double teaming, you got to help. Everyone has to be on a string. You got to help off of him. And so that was really giving him, in addition to transition, periods where he could catch the ball without someone right in front of him or with one guy rotating to him and could make a play. But Conley was a big part of all that, just moving the ball, making the right decision instantly when it hits his hands.
Huge part of that. And there's a parallel with another veteran 30-something with Nicolas Batum in the Sixers series, where you noticed both in absentia and in presence how having a quick decision maker and an adept passer makes the offense work, even if that player is off ball a significant portion of time. Conley's on ball significantly more than Nicolas Batum is, but it gives your offense a little bit more function. It gives it a little bit more reactivity. And I thought that the Wolves, it looked a lot better. They had a 118 offensive rating in the first half. And even though they only had an 88 first shot half-court offensive rating, they were able to get enough in transition. They were able to get enough through those offensive rebounding. By the way, they had a 40% offensive rebound rate in the first half. They were able to get enough. And Conley's aggressiveness as an individual scorer also helped keep Denver honest, where, he can do it. And I was so encouraged by how Conley looked physically at times in the second half, particularly. In the first half, it's like, yeah, he's kind of getting it along. But then he like had some burst for a defensive rebound. He had a couple plays where he like got into the paint. And so he's not 100%, clearly, but closer to it. And another important dynamic as we're heading towards the game 7 here is that there is an extra day off. Game 7 will be on Sunday. I'm guessing it's going to be 8 Eastern, 5 Pacific. The NBA hasn't announced that yet that I've seen. So there will be a lot of time for these teams and players to get right physically before the series that we were most excited about so far gets its 7th game.
Yeah, and so a lot of time for the Nuggets to think about how they're going to try to deal with things. They unleashed Murray more than before. I thought the Wolves did with their strategy of just really, again, trying to stick really close to Jokic. If there was a Murray-Jokic action and Karl-Anthony Towns was on Jokic, you'd basically just stick to him. They would just let Murray come downhill against, if Ant did a great job, like going under, meeting him on the other side. Like he does a great job of not getting screened off. And Murray is one of the hardest guys to guard in the league in terms of just the amount of effort that it takes. And McDaniels did the same. So, and Alexander Walker was good there too. And then Gobert is hanging out under the basket, and kind of the Murray going at Gobert with Gordon along the baseline. That doesn't work as well as Jokic going at Gobert with Gordon on the baseline. And they wouldn't let Jokic get the ball in those circumstances. So the gamble was that Jamal Murray wasn't going to be able to beat them. And given how off and on he has been in these playoffs, I thought that was a pretty good one. And you can even make the argument that Denver, this was not that dissimilar from the defense that was played in games 3 and 4, but Denver just hit incredible shots. Some of that was Jokic, and they kind of took him out of things. He was 9 and 19, but was way better than any other Nugget, basically. And to just say, all right, Jamal Murray, like, we don't think that you can do it. Now, he's got a great history as a big game player. He's been very inconsistent, and he's played, probably a total of 2 good games, like 1 good game and 2 good halves by his standards in these playoffs. So as we look ahead to game 7 now, I think it actually has a pretty decent chance of being close. And
it would be, which would be a rarity in this series. This has been a very fun series for one that hasn't really had much in the way of games that were like close late or anything like that.
And the nature of a game 7 usually is that teams don't shoot incredibly well. And if this Wolves strategy is going to be to force Denver to shoot in the high 30s in terms of 3-point attempts, if they can successfully do that again, and that I think is what you ultimately have to get to. And if like the rest of Denver is not playing incredibly well right now, so to put the pressure on them, like they missed a lot of open shots in this game. I'll be very honest about that. But to just say, yeah, we are not letting Nikola Jokic put up 30 points in this game. I don't care. Denver maybe wasn't ready for that. They will be more ready for it. They will be at home. Minnesota largely avoided, stupid mistakes and foul trouble. Like they just were so much tighter in this game. And then Denver didn't punish them for their mistakes either. And of course they had by far the effort advantage. So 2 days off hopefully will help Murray. We'll see where Edwards is at. Is he just going to go all 48? It's going to be like, I'm not sure what else there is to talk about really in terms of adjustments. Maybe
I have a couple things that are connecting game 6 and theoretically game 7. So one of them is that Jaden McDaniels did more on ball. And I thought that generally went well for the Wolves. No guarantee that it'll go well in a
when you say on ball, like they weren't running plays for him necessarily, but he was shooting the 3 and attacking very well off.
Yeah, like even more than 2 dribbles and a good decision at times. It was, getting into the lane, doing something else, and attacking a closeout, things in that variety. And McDaniels has that in his background. It's not like what you want to build your offense around, but if he has a wide open path to the basket, he could do something with it. There was a play where he blew by Jamal Murray so fast that Jokic couldn't get over there. Not that Jokic is the fastest help defender anyway. And I thought that opened up some opportunities for the Wolves. Again, it's not what you want to build things around, but you can take advantage, especially when Denver is double teaming, overplaying, switching. You can get him into an advantage matchup and make something work there.
Yeah, and when McDaniels is scoring well, that really completely changes things for the Wolves offense, to be sure.
The next
And yeah,
one, unless we have something more on
no,
that,
go ahead.
is the Nuggets changed around Jokic's rest because I think they wanted to keep the game at least closer to contact at the beginning of the second, which is when Jokic usually comes out. He comes
Yeah,
out kind of,
and good luck with that. Yeah, he goes out. They get it back to 11. He goes out, and it's instantly 19 again.
and a part of the reason why that happened was it became the Aaron Gordon show, and it was some of the worst offense I've seen in these entire playoffs, which is
Well,
saying
going
something.
at Gobert for him is
Yeah,
not very smart.
because
Like go at literally anyone else, he's got the physical advantage on, I would say, but not Gobert.
But Aaron Gordon, and this is going back to my frustrations with him, even like you could even go beyond Orlando to some of the film at Arizona. I didn't like watch his high school film or anything like that. Is he's just too confident in certain matches. Like he doesn't do like assessment of like, okay, this is how to attack. This is what I'm gonna do. He's just like, this is what I have. This is what I'm gonna go after. And he had just a couple of truly terrible possessions. There was one where he gets Gobert on him and then is just like dribbling around and shoots a contested 10, 15 footer, which had zero chance. And they also like didn't really try to get anything else out there. I don't think we're going to see too much of that in game 7, but it is worth noting. And then the other one, unfortunately, but hopefully, considering he played 34 minutes, is Anthony Edwards had that bad fall and looks like basically kind of hit the ground hard towards his tailbone. We don't know for sure any of the designations on that yet. I'm optimistic considering he's made out of adamantium that he'll be okay, but it won't take Edwards being off a little bit would be a huge problem for Minnesota.
So for Denver, I think they need to decide what they want to do against Towns and Edwards. Do they stick with the double teaming and say, hey, Minnesota's not going to hit as many shots? And they got lit up in the first half, even as you noted, with them going, I think it was 6-21 in the first half. And so they want to stick with that. Like they're kind of at their best flying around because it forces them to have more energy. But do you really want to be double teaming Anthony Edwards pretty much every single time he touches the ball, unless maybe KCP is on him? Like if they called up Porter Jr., they had a lot of success with that when Porter Jr. was on Ant absolutely put him on skates on one play. So they had to kind of go to the switch double there with Porter Jr. There's just a lot of matchups that one-on-one Denver's kind of not that willing to live with. They're switching everything with Towns and Edwards, or even Conley and Towns, and getting Towns in the post against KCP. And they were kind of going pretty instantly to the double team, and Minnesota was able to beat that. Are they going to still go there? They're going to try to stay a little bit more solid. You don't want to do that because it opens up the Towns pick and pop game. But it does feel like maybe they need a little something different there. Maybe just the play better adjustment is what it is. I'm not sure that any of these options are that much better. I think you just got to kind of hope that the Wolves offense, goes back to being the Wolves offense as it's been for 3 of the 6 games in this series. And then also, see if your offense can get better. I mean, this was like such a game from hell in terms of the shooting that they became demoralized. And it was clear by the mid-third quarter when McDaniels hit that left corner 3 when he had like 15 minutes that had us turning off the live show that, Denver was kind of done in terms of actually trying in this game because nobody even bothered to try and rotate to him. I think they're going to have to examine that, but I don't know if they're going to come to necessarily other answers. And the other thing they got to do is figure out how to put some pressure on the rim. What are they going to do there? How are they going to get Gobert back on Jokic? I think it was notable that even when Gobert was on Jokic, they still actually came and double teamed as well. So if that's what it's going to be, then you should be able to get some stuff going to the rim. Gobert was amazing, just cutting off some of the back cuts that were open. So that made it harder to let guys come off of those Jokic screens. But they still got pretty good looks out of that. But they got to figure out a way to open up the rim again. And that, of course, is just such a strategic battleground in any series, including this one, because they can't be taken. They're not going to win in almost all likelihood unless they get a great shooting performance. So they get 6 shots at the rim, 5 shots at the rim in a half.
Yeah. Oh, one other thing worth keeping an eye on. I thought that having Kyle Anderson out there with Rudy Gobert and at a portion of the I think it was the second quarter. That was troublesome because it kind of short circuited the Conley Gobert pick and roll. He didn't play much in the second half, but I'm not going to read too much signal into that second half because it wasn't, we turned off the broadcast about halfway through. But picking and choosing Kyle Anderson's minutes will be a small but important part of Game 7.
Sauce Slinger asks, which team's strategies that have given them success in the series do you feel the most repeatable in Game 7? Yeah, I think still, like, Denver's got to just run their shit, run their Jokic and Murray shit. And if they're giving Jamal Murray shots, like, expect him to make them. Like, he is that level of player. And also, I think if they are double teaming, you just have some specific plays ready for that, specific screening actions ready for that. I think when you know they're double teaming, go into the post very early in the possession to Jokic. Give yourself some chance to beat that around the horn as well, and hope that you can make shots. And also, you just have to defend a little bit better. But I'm still not sure exactly how they do that, other than just like executing better what they've been doing and rotating better as well. And also hoping that the Wolves kind of shoot themselves in the foot a little bit and that they're just going to outsmart them in the end. So, yeah, I mean, I think in terms of the replicability of the strategy, it's probably just making sure Jokic doesn't beat you as a scorer. And let's see what happens with these role players who have made shots a lot. Justin Holiday, is he still like the second coming? And Christian Braun and Gordon and, Porter Jr. and Murray are more accomplished shooters, but they're still not as accomplished or at least as consistent as Jokic is. So I think that is probably the strategy number one, of just like, we are not going to let Nikola Jokic just go one-on-one and beat us in the mid-range.
I do think Denver will have some better adjustments on that in a Game 7, but it's a harder thing to solve when you're getting the jump shots for not necessarily the greatest group of players, and they'll hit more of them than they did in Game 6, but that will still be a challenge. A question from IE: how much do you think Jamal Murray's poor performance is injury versus the Wolves' defense, and everything else? So Murray, we didn't talk too much about his injury when he was playing 40 minutes a game and scoring, about 50% from the field in the 3 wins that Denver had. He's definitely not 100%, but I'm not going to put most of it on the injury when he's played reasonably well over the last week or so. So it's a factor, but it's not the factor. I think Denver's playing him really well. And Anthony Edwards is a pain in the ass to play against defensively. And he's so he's strong. When Jamal Murray, Kevin Pelton and I actually did an extended conversation about this before the series started, is that Jamal Murray really is comfortable in strength advantage matchups, and he doesn't have one of those against Anthony Edwards. And so it was something I wanted to watch in the series, and he doesn't do it every game in the regular season because it's unreasonable to ask that of anybody. But as a guard defender of a player who's not like explosively, like ludicrously quick, Edwards does a really, really good job. And so I want to give a majority of the credit, not a totality of it, to Edwards, to the Wolves D.
And then other thing I want to say too is Jokic is shooting the 3 very poorly in these playoffs. He's 0-4 tonight. That's not like what he wants to do, but in the past, when that's been what's available to him, he's hunted that shot and he's made it. He's certainly very capable of making it. Like, that shot will certainly be there for Jokic at many times if he wants to take it. And, is that something that he could lean into a little bit more if some of his inside the arc game isn't there as much? This still has the feel of, after the series is over, wow, like the established champion, they fended off this amazing comeback, and then this amazing challenge from Anthony Edwards, the next star, but this young team that's just not quite ready yet. That we've seen this series many, many times in history, but Minnesota's absolutely capable of winning this game. I mean, if they just defend as well as they did in this game, like, they're going to be right there. So let's talk a little free agent centers here now. And we break these down usually into superstar, star, and starter. Nobody in those categories, at least at the center position. Of course, we've done all the other positions except for center. So my number one ranked guy, do you agree with me, is Isaiah Hartenstein.
I do. It felt earlier in the season like this was going to be a parallel of a couple years ago where Hartenstein gets underappreciated. And that year he got less money than fellow unrestricted free agent Mitchell Robinson. They signed with the same team. And this year time was going to be a different New York center, Nic Claxton. Claxton is a very good player. And Claxton, he had a much better 22-23 season than the most recent one, which will hurt his momentum. But I think part of what Hartenstein brings, I think he's he's a more traditional rim protector, but he does those things well. And then Hartenstein, it's not like he is a dominant post presence. It's not like you're going to build your whole offense around Hartenstein. But I like the way he can make plays out of the high post. I like the way that he can be a facilitator, and how, even though it happened in season and Tom Thibodeau is not the most intuitive coach on incorporating this kind of stuff, his centers are notoriously low usage. Hartenstein they found ways to make him a positive offensive player in the way that they have not empowered any of the other Knicks centers to do.
Yeah, and he works particularly well with Brunson. It's definitely a much different New York offense when Mitchell Robinson or Precious Achiuwa or Jericho Sims is at center, because Hartenstein can find those back doors. He'll play the DHO game. He's much better at those little like blind pig actions they like to run when Brunson is denied. So he's a really good player. I think really how much he's going to get paid just comes back to the Knicks and their situation. And we talked about OG Anunoby in the small forward rankings. And I think now is going to be the time that James Dolan, who used to pay a ton of tax even for teams that sucked 15 years ago, they haven't paid the tax, I don't think, at least since the early Carmelo era, if not maybe even earlier than that. And they've had a lot of cap space teams. They've never really been that good. Now's the time. And they have to re-sign Isaiah Hartenstein. They cannot let him get away. Problem there, though, they only have early bird rights on him. Mm-hmm. And that early bird contract that they can offer him is basically right around, well, so it'd be 175% of what he's making now. So is where they would start. So pretty similar to Malik Monk. He's making 9.3 this year. And so, 175% of that'll be like 16 million or so. Then you can get raises from there. But, 4 years and like about 70 million or so, just doing that math off the top of my head. Is that enough for him at this point in time? Like, is there another team that could come in and say, like, we're going to beat that offer for the 26-year-old who really he's gotten paid, 8-9 million the last couple of years, but didn't make anything in his career before that?
It's wild that this is the second time that Hartenstein is getting complicated. His free agency is complicated by insufficient bird rights because he's bounced around so much and been underpaid. Because that's, of course, what happened with the Clippers years ago. Yeah. And
well, I think the Clippers made the right to. There's an understanding maybe that he would have stayed there on a 1+1 for what was then the tax MLE, but they wanted to sign John Wall instead. It was probably the right decision.
It didn't turn out super well, but in terms of what they needed at the time, and the challenge.
I was being sarcastic.
That I know. Was fucking terrible. But so the dynamic for both Claxton and Hartenstein, both of them have significant internal leverage. The teams that have them right now want to keep them. However, this ties in with something that I like, a table I like to set for when we're talking about positions of, well, who are the teams that could be competing? And certainly conceptually in either case, maybe a sign and trade could come in, but that would be really hard because both these teams want to keep their players. And so they can at least posture like that they don't want to make that happen. And so you go through the teams that are going to have more than the non-taxpayer mid-level. And I'm going to do this more on
and the non-taxpayer mid-level, that just so we have it relative to what he could be paid. Non-taxpayer mid-level, we are projecting that to be 4 years, 55 million. So yes. the Knicks can offer him more than a non-taxpayer mid-level team. So it would take a cap space team or a sign and trade, which if I'm the Knicks, I would never agree to.
Absolutely not. And so the teams that are looking to have cap space this summer, and I'll go mostly by the expected, and then I'll get into the unlikely. So Orlando, Philly, Oklahoma City. They're all Detroit.
Yeah.
Like
Yeah.
those teams are all pretty much definitely in the mix. Charlotte could be, Toronto could be, Utah could be, but I expect them to use that money on Larry Markkinen. And then the Spurs don't have enough, and also they have somebody named Victor Wembanyama at center.
Yeah. The Spurs could have enough. They could open up like $20 million.
Yeah, they could make it, but again, that would be a poor use of their capital. As much as I love Isaiah Hartenstein and believe he'll get underpaid relative to my expectations. So you go through that group, and you don't see many teams where it's like, oh, center is their need, or center could be a priority. I think Isaiah Hartenstein would make the Pistons better. I think Isaiah Hartenstein would be a really fascinating kind of not even a hedge, but basically for Orlando, they have the idea that Wendell Carter Jr. is a very good player, but he's only under contract for 2 more years. If you could get Hartenstein on a team-friendly deal for longer, then maybe you could make that work as kind of a value proposition. I don't expect that to happen. They're going to have other priorities. And Philly, they have Joel Embiid. So the suitors are narrow for both Claxton and Hartenstein. I think that's going to push them back to their current teams at a number that those teams are more willing to live with, but probably not all the way like totally squeezing, because they are really valuable. And the question that I'm interested in from both the Claxton and the Hartenstein perspective is, how interested are they, both mid-20s? Hartenstein's roughly a year older than Claxton, age 26 for Hartenstein this summer, 25 for Claxton. Is okay, we have maybe an idea of the number with Hartenstein due to the limitations with early bird, Claxton's full bird. Do they look at this market and say, hey, I'm going to get the money I can for as many years as I can, make that work out? Or do they say, whether it's a 1+1 or a 2+1, I'd rather get out there in a more flush market. You are taking a long-term risk, but you could get out there, you'd still be in your 20s and can make it work. And if I'm Hartenstein's I think I might see this a little differently as the two of them, because Hartenstein his career has been so itinerant that maybe you want to see it. But it honestly, it's probably mostly about the player's willingness to accept risk.
Well, I think he's just really happy to be in New York too, and not New York.
Though signing a team-friendly contract is a good way to eventually get off that team.
Well, but they need a center though. Like Tom Thibodeau needs a center, and Mitchell Robinson, from a health perspective, is just too unreliable at this point. Like they have to re-sign him. There was a time when I was like, okay, well, they signed Robinson, and hey, Precious Achiuwa, they got him. They could squeeze him restricted free agency, get him back at kind of a backup price, let Hartenstein go. That's not an option anymore, given what's taken place to me in these playoffs. And with Claxton, I think maybe there's a team that could be interested in him in a sign and trade. Charlotte is the one of those cap space teams if they let Miles Bridges go. Otherwise, they're not really going to have much cap space. Or if he goes himself, they could have $30 million, but they're still trying to build around Mark Williams, and the hiring of Charles Lee would indicate they're still trying to do more of a youth move. These guys are young enough too to be part of that. But if they're really trying to take a step forward, they could maybe sign Hartenstein and then kind of go the Gafford Lively route. But it does seem like he also would just rather go back to New York if the money is like anywhere close. And I don't think it would be responsible for a team to blow New York's offer out of the water if they give him that max early bird that they can. So like you said, I think be back. Brooklyn, though, with Claxton, the bigger issue for them is, what does his contract look like when they have this 2025 cap space plan? And do they really want to end up paying him a big amount? When Mike Scotto and Brian Lewis talked about this on the Hoopside podcast, they talked about how Claxton, could get 20 to 25 million a year. He has the advantage of the Nets having full bird rights, which I think Hartenstein has probably outplayed him and deserves more, but the Knicks don't have full bird rights on him, only the early bird. So maybe Claxton ends up getting paid more, but it is hard for me to see him getting, like 80 million guaranteed. That seems just like a little aggressive. Maybe it ends up being a 3-year deal, something that they feel like they could move if they have to.
And it might end up being that things kind of line up for the Nets in that respect. The lack of external leverage is a huge problem for Claxton. And again, maybe the Pistons, the Detroit leverages come calling, but maybe not. And I mean, they have a lot of different things, and they have Jalen Durr. So do you even buy a bluff from Claxton or Hartenstein's representation that they're going to go in that direction? Potentially a new decision maker at the top of the Pistons could shift that, but I mean, they have a lot of different things they could do there, and the lack of other teams is a very real concern for Claxton and Hartenstein in this circumstance. And what is a concern for the rest of the league is the lack of center quality outside of those two gentlemen. So it's a limited group full of largely guys that you and I aren't the biggest fans of relative to other people, with a few notable exceptions there. And so, like, I mean, the most prominent in terms of his role and everything this current season was Jonas Valanciunas. There's already been some speculation, I believe this was from Mike Scotto as well, that Valanciunas is not going to be a Pelican next year. I don't know that that's set in stone or anything like that. New Orleans has an unusual cap circumstance that we'll get into in their offseason preview. But Valanciunas is not only is he outdated in terms of what centers primarily do now, but the bigger problem for the Pelicans, and more specifically now for Valanciunas individually, is that he is not good enough at the things that centers need to do to work. He is such a bad rim protector that the Pelicans have built their scheme, and in part around not allowing people to get to the rim because they know that if they get there, they'll score.
Yeah. And yet the Pels have about 14 million below the tax. We're projecting them to defer that Lakers pick, which I think the deadline for that has got to be pretty soon, but I think they would be foolish not to do that. It's going to be, I think, like 17 or something like that. So might as well roll the dice again in a better draft next year on that one. So maybe there's Valanciunas coming back on another deal somewhat similar if they don't feel they can trade for a better center. I think they got to figure out what's happening with Ingram. There's this growing expectation that he may not be back there, so potentially they get a center back in that deal, and then they don't need Valanciunas back. They still got Nance as a backup center, but I still foresee a possibility where both sides are just like, shit, I guess we just like he still is a player who does some things for us. We don't have another starting center on the roster. There isn't anyone else they could sign in free agency for an exception, really, that would be in their price range. Maybe they could try to go the sign and trade route with a Claxton. Or are they going to trade for Jared Allen or something along those lines? Like I think so much depends on what happens. But if the Pels can't get another center, like, they kind of have to bring him back. They have no way to replace him, really. And he does at least help them some. So I know David Griffin says there's going to be all this change, and there probably is. But I still, if I had to pick one team that he's most likely to be on next year, it's probably still the Pels.
It is, and part of the reason also for that is, I brought it before, how the cap space teams aren't center needy. There aren't going to be that many non-taxpayer mid-level teams. They're not center needy either. You can run through like Brooklyn, and I mean, Chicago potentially could be, Cleveland maybe, but they're probably going to do Okoro instead. Houston traded for Steven Adams. Remember that? He was unavailable. Indy probably isn't going to make it work. And I mean, the Thunder, I guess, are a cap space team, but they're not going to use that money on Valanciunas. The Raptors, if they stay over, the Jazz, if they, like, with the room exception, the Wizards, like, maybe the Wizards would be, they could be in a different boat, but it's not really a robust market for the sub, like the possible starter group either. And so that is, it's going to be awkward. Now, then maybe the room exception ends up being enough. Maybe you end up kind of being in a different place, but there could be some awkward reunions as well.
Luke Cornett and Andre Drummond are two of the next guys for me. Both guys who've been backups. Drummond has kind of been, he was very excited to get slightly more than the minimum. And I think he maybe deserves a little bit more than that. Like,
he was the best center on the he was the best center on the Bulls this year, but that's damning with a version of faint praise.
And I mean, the Bulls need a backup center. The
Bulls need a starting center, but
yes, that too. And again, there's just not really a better replacement for him. Certainly not in-house. It's not like the Bulls have this third center that they want to promote necessarily.
God,
And
if the
Kornet,
Bulls could open up cap space and get Hartenstein or Claxton, I would feel better about them.
Yeah, and maybe that could be a sign and trade, but I mean, there's so much uncertainty there too. Like Drummond won't be at the top of their list, but they will have bird rights to bring him back, and depending on what happens with DeRozan and their situation, they're going to try to make some trades, I would assume. Financially, how much can they bring him back for? They certainly need him. I'm sure they want to bring him back. Same thing with Kornet, and he's an unrestricted free agent at 28. I think he's been really important, particularly to their regular season success. He executes Joe Mazzulla's scheme, protects the rim, can finish around the rim. He's not a guy they probably want playing in the playoffs, but also if you're going to have Al Horford and Kristaps Porzingis, you need a third center just to keep the mileage off of them. So they have bird rights on him, but also they have these tax constraints. However, it would make more sense to pay to bring him back because they're not going to be able to even use the tax mid-level. And he could also potentially be some matching salary for them as well if they want to make a trade, because they still have a bunch of picks out there. So, I mean, a fair salary for him to me would be kind of, $7 million a year or something like that. Does he get that somewhere else? Like good, solid backup center money. But I'm not sure if they can afford to pay him that, but they also can't afford to let him leave for a team that is really, trying to be a contender. And they're like, who is the Kornet replacement that's better than him? Is that Xavier Tillman? They just bring him back in that role. Like they haven't even been playing Xavier Tillman in the playoffs, even without Porzingis.
The walking trade exception concept with Kornet is intriguing, but that requires Celtics ownership being on board. And part of the significance of the Drew Holiday extension, which we talked about at the time, is there is a potential pathway for for Boston to either lower their bill or kind of the second apron stuff. We're going to have to see where some of the final numbers come in for them. And I mean, we'll get a Tatum extension, I would guess, at some point in the future too. So it's a possibility with Kornet that he could use that. And it's so hard with the new second apron rules to add salary any other way than a human trade exception. I do think we'll see a couple of those this year. Tillman would conceptually be another option for that, but Kornet is the one who's playing over him for a reason. Tillman's so limited offensively, even though I've been a big fan of his defense for years now. And the thing that will help Kornet is that just the kind of lack of other suitable players in this group, particularly for teams that have a need for it. So like Mo Wagner there's an $8 million team option the Magic have on him.
He'll be brought back on that for sure, I would think.
I would assume he
given
will
who his brother is.
And also because the Wagner-Isaac dynamic is so fascinating, because Wagner is a valid center for the Magic, even though he doesn't do center stuff well because Jonathan Isaac is such a good defensive player. And so Wagner, he's not a good rim protector. He's not really good. I don't love him in any defensive scheme particularly, but he's an efficient offensive player who sets good screens and can do things well enough. And so for Orlando,
underrated offensively, like he's got
yes.
Mid 60s true shooting every year with like over a 20% usage. Like that's very impressive.
And he's been efficient on a variety of different teams and circumstances through his own itinerant career to this point with the Wizards and the Lakers and everything else. And so Wagner, and it being functionally a 1-year contract, I think that works well for the Magic too, because they have they have a lot of variability. We'll do their offseason preview at some point, but I think there's a very reasonable theory that they'll kind of have more space than they know what to do with. And also Wagner on a functional one year expiring contract, if they pick up the option, then you could even use him as matching salary trade if you really wanted to, not that they necessarily would. But you go through the other ones like Drew Eubanks, not really moving the needle too much for me. Mason Plumlee, never a Dunc'd On favorite.
Yeah, I mean, all these guys feel like basically minimum guys at this point.
The only one that would be a possible exception to that is also on the Magic, and that's Goga Bitadze. And Bitadze at times flashed that rim protection, which was exciting at various moments in Indiana. One of the 4 different young centers they've tried out in the last few years. Send him along. But Bitadze, there are two things. One is do you believe the rim protection is real? The other one is, do you think that he can be a backup in the traditional sense, which is that the other part of being a backup is stepping in and being a starter when your starter is hurt. And I think Batanze can
I
do
think
that.
he's proven he could do that. Yeah.
I agree. I think he can. But in order to get into that like $6, $7, $8 million range, much less the like 12, a team has to be confident in that. And I mean, I think Batanze is going to end up being one of the better values in free agency just because there's not a lot of buzz there. And like he may end up being like kind of like what Hartenstein was like 4 years ago. And a circumstance, not that I'm saying Batanze is going to have the arc that he did, but he's somebody who does the most important thing pretty well and who doesn't need to have a large role in the offense. So like I would prioritize for me Batanze over a lot of these other options, especially as a team like, so for example, like the Clippers. I mean, I don't know that they're going to have the money to make that work, but I would much rather have Batanze if they could convince him, be like, hey, you could have a good year with us because he's closer to what Zubats is. And so you could go that route, but they're probably going to not do that. They'll probably keep Plumlee, maybe keep Tice, and just roll things back.
Yeah, and I think he's the guy that I might be willing to go like, all right, I'll pay you $6 million a year on a 3-year deal, maybe last year non-guaranteed. And because he does still, in theory, have that shooting potential. Like that is not something the Magic explored at all, but that could be a very valuable skill set. And he's not very good offensively, but yeah, splashed as a rim protector. Jackson Hayes has this player option. Christian Wood already opted in there. He again is a guy who's like, all right, if you need a body at backup center, maybe you can do it. But he just doesn't play very hard. It's not really a serious player. Can get some alley-oops, run the floor in transition. That's basically about it. Has no physicality defensively, which is, so if he has to guard someone in the post or whatever, he's not great there, not great on the defensive glass. And Xavier Tillman, always a favorite of ours, still I think a very high quality defender. He also had I think in Memphis, he was 45% true shooting or something just insanely bad like that, and was better in Boston, but I think it is noteworthy he hasn't played much in Boston, even with the Porzingis injury, and he just really struggles offensively. He'll set some screens. I think he can switch. He's a really, really good defensive player. So can you bring him in as a backup center and just hope that he'll defend? Hopefully you can, but I don't love him as your primary backup center because he's not really a guy who can run pick and roll at all. And that's part of the job description.
And there are, as always, a multitude of fringy, maybe they make a roster, probably get guarantees and shouldn't centers. I don't even think we need to necessarily go through them. A lot of names that'll be familiar, like Damian Jones and Bismack Biyombo and Mo Bamba and Thomas Bryant and everything else. And Thomas Bryant also, he has a player option he could pick up just if he doesn't think there's a better offer somewhere else. Could do that. So yeah, those players are available. Some of them will work out, some of them will not, but I don't expect any of them to get significantly more than I don't expect any of them to get more than the minimum, much less significantly more than the minimum. Any of those guys unrestricted that we haven't talked about that you think are worth discussion?
Let's see. Tristan Thompson played well enough this year that he deserves to have a job. And Alex Len, Bismack Biyombo, you could probably bring those guys in and just hope that they do a little something. JaVale McGee is probably done. And Damian Jones has had some ones. He's already 29 somehow. I think Rashawn Holmes could opt into that player option at age 30. And
I'm surprised he hasn't already.
Well, maybe because of Dallas's issues in terms of the tax, that they could get him to opt out and just sign him for a longer term deal that would just be more digestible at less money per season, but probably not. So on the restricted line, Jericho Sims has a team option. They'll probably just pick that up. He's been okay in the regular season. And then you've got a bunch of guys who are not that exciting, except for maybe Precious Achiuwa, who's kind of between the 4 and the 5, has some versatility, maybe still at age 24, some shooting potential to explore, can put the ball on the floor and dunk at half the time and pick up a charge the other half of the time. But like there are some raw skills there, to be sure. The Knicks, I mean, maybe they try to play the restricted free agent game with him. You could even see him maybe coming back on a qualifying offer. Actually, yeah, I wonder if he made the starter criteria. That would be. I should probably know that off the top of my head, but that could be an interesting. If he hasn't made the starter criteria, it's probably easier for New York to give him a qualifying offer. Otherwise, he might end up unrestricted because if they're going to pay Hartenstein, they're going to pay OG Anunoby, they might feel like we just can't afford to give Achua a significant deal.
It's possible, and maybe another team sees the we looked like it was going to happen with Emmanuel quickly, but then quickly ends up with the Raptors of a restricted free agent that another team feels they can poach. There just isn't that much salary flexibility around the league for a team that screams like great fit. Okay, let's use this as a proposition.
But what's a fair contract for him in a vacuum, you think?
I like Achua more than most. But I don't think he's a starter. So maybe somewhere in the like 7 to 10 million range.
Yeah, like 20 million guaranteed.
Sure.
It depends how you want to distribute it. And there really is, as we talked about, there's not much quality. So some of these cap teams might end up just wanting to bring him in because they just have space when the music stops, right? Like Charlotte, for example, if Bridges leaves, or maybe a room exception team that you could see them bring him in. Like, would he be a backup center in Houston? Not necessarily a room exception team, but they'll have the mid level. They might want to, like, he would kind of fit into their system, doing a lot of switching. Like that could be kind of interesting. To replace like a Jeff Green or a Jock Landale.
Well, I mean, Steven Adams might be doing that, but it's good to have a different theory. Yeah. And for the
Rockets, but then Adams only has 1 year left on his deal too, and
sure.
You don't know if he's going to be healthy. So like there are definitely teams that might just be like, all right, yeah, this is better than doing nothing with their money, and I would say that's true. And like Houston, he would be a really good fit, right? A team that wants to do a lot of switching on their second unit, he would fit in extremely well.
Sure, and I could see Achua like. I would love to see Detroit upgrade at backup center, especially considering like one of the names we haven't mentioned here is James Wiseman. Wiseman was terrible. I've said before that if I were running a team, I wouldn't give him an NBA contract this year. He may get there in time. And I think that an NBA team probably will give him a contract, but I think it's going to be maybe like 26-year-old, 25-year-old James Wiseman that is actually an NBA player as opposed to the current one. I would be more comfortable giving Dominic Barlow a contract. Not that I've toned down a little bit on him because it's just kind of where he fits. He does some secondary playmaking.
I think he's got some shooting potential. I think he plays hard. I think he's got some mobility defensively. He can challenge shots. He plays really hard, gets on the boards. I would just be a lot more interested in him than some of these, like Jackson Hayes or even maybe Plumlee at this point, although Plumlee at least has some veteranosity. But we just know a lot of these teams have centers under contracts. That's part of why it's so thin right now. But I do think he could be pretty decent. It could, and it just has a chance of being better. And at 21, he has a chance to grow elsewhere. But the Spurs, he's restricted there. You imagine that'll end up getting held down and he'll be brought back.
Quick note on Sims. Sims has a team option. The reason that would get declined is if the Knicks wanted to make him a restricted free agent. I don't think that's worth it with him. I think that you keep him on discounted contract, and if Sims happens to leave after that year, so be it. And Neemias Queta is an interesting example, kind of a similar concept where Queta, if the Celtics pick up his team option, then he would be unrestricted in 25. But as a third center possibility, the Celtics. He's been in their organization this year. Maybe they're interested in him as kind of a minimum stopgap there to make it work for, that if one of Tillman or Cornette leaves, then you keep him around.
Well, and it was pointed out to me too. I forgot that Richaun Holmes actually got traded to the Wizards. Probably actually part of that Dallas deal that doesn't get discussed enough. Maybe because, people forget what team he's on. Mm-hmm. But yeah, so Holmes is with the Wizards now, so yeah, they don't really have any reason to play any games with him. So yeah, he'll just end up opting in, or maybe be a trade candidate if they want to take back even worse longer term money. It's not like he played himself into like looking better in Washington necessarily. Let's take some of these comments here, unless you really want to hit on any of these other guys, which I don't think I necessarily do.
Well, I guess the only one I want to mention, just because it intrigues me, is Tristan Vukcevic. So he came over late in the season for the Wiz, had been taken in the second round previously. They have it's his contract is structured interestingly. It's a
I think they're
24-25.
doing the Jonte Porter on him, don't you
That's
think?
probably what it is.
Yeah.
And so they'll
I guess we
decline
can't
that.
call it that anymore,
Well, they'll
can we?
decline that team option, and
Because
then in
that
3
is
years he'll get banned from the NBA for gambling. So
yeah, yeah.
we'll have to see where that goes. But
We'll have
Vukcevic,
to find someone else now, where you sign the guy because you can't give him a longer contract, and then you
and
make him a restricted
and
free agent and
and
sign him to a longer deal.
even though
with a team
he's
option.
Vukcevic and it's Vucevic, we can't probably use the last name either, because I don't know what that is, like overpaying a guy when you had no reason to do so. So but we could get into
Yeah.
we can get into some of the questions. Can you from Bernard? This is a good one. Can you see more teams trying the Mavericks tag team center approach we've seen in the playoffs? Yes, I hope that it leads to copycats. However, the Mavericks have an unusually favorable ecosystem for that, in that those centers are similar to each other, and they have lead offensive players who understand the differences between them well enough. So, like, a lot of times you just can't get a center who's that similar. And so, from a defensive, from an offensive perspective, so yes, I think teams could and should do it more. It's not an every team solution.
Well, I think it makes sense when one of the centers is on a rookie contract. And the fact that Lively has produced this quickly, I think even the greatest optimists about him he's exceeded their projections this season to be contributing on a second round of the playoffs level of team right now. But when you think about just the resources that you're going to put into it, if you're just signing two guys who are that good, that's probably just too expensive for building your team. When if you have one of those guys, you just play that guy more and fix some of your other holes. Dallas is, and then they've got guys like Exum and Jones on small contracts as well, and Gafford is on a good deal going forward. So to be paying those guys combined what they are, it works, but in part because you've got a guy in a rookie contract who's actually this effective. So I think it's good. It's tough to replicate for that reason. Let's see here. Chris says he'd love Hartenstein in Detroit. I'm curious to see whether they go for another center. I think there's probably a feeling at this point, especially if they get another head of basketball operations, that they're not going to do that. They've just acquired so many centers. They have Duren, who's supposed to be part of their plans. They have Stewart, who really should be a center. Now, is there so much pressure that if they just strike out on some of their other stuff, they would bring him in? They could use some more passing, but they also could use some more shooting, which he doesn't really provide. So he's a good player, and that might just be, if the edict is get as good as you can this year, which I fear it might be, then maybe they do just bring him in. I think he would help them play harder and play smarter, but kind of lower on the list of Pistons needs to me.
I liked Evan's note that Valanciunas can't sign with the Raptors because they won't get him until they can figure out a way to give up a lottery pick for him. That's fun. And we got asked about Jalen Smith. Jalen Smith was discussed in the power forward rankings, but yeah, he may end up being a team's backup center solution as well.
Yeah, his player option. I think he'll opt out of there, but yeah, he's, again, when you talk about the limited options at this position, maybe he is going to do substantially better than that player option. Let's see here. What else do we got in terms of the questions? Could Claxton have a Daniel Gafford type rise on a team with better pick and roll operators, where you get easier finishing looks or short roll creation opportunities? I think Claxton might still be better than Gafford. Honestly, Claxton is a great rim protector, and he's got more defensive versatility. He's not as big. He's not as good of a rebounder. Although I don't know that Gafford, if we'll see it maybe in the next round of like how good he actually is defending the post. I don't think it's going to be very good in the end. But yeah, I think Claxton is a better player than Gafford, and he would look much better on a team that has more creation.
And
for him,
Nic Claxton had 69% true shooting last year. It's not like you have to go that far back for him to be an efficient offensive player.
All right, I think we'll take one more here from Basketball Genesis. Do you believe Peyton Watson and Christian Braun would still be NBA players on any other team? NBA players, yeah, absolutely. But in terms of like being rotation players, yeah, I think so. Like they both really defend. And Watson is like a really good rim protector, and they may need him if they have to play against Dallas or OKC in the next round for that reason. And yeah, I think both of those guys are like talented young players who don't really do anything too poorly other than shoot the ball. So most coaches would like them, and like having players who have really good athleticism who can defend is something that every team needs coming off their bench. All right, that will do it here.
Do you want to
Yeah.
pick some winners?
Yes. I was gonna transition to that. I will let you go first.
I'll pick Sauce Slinger. Ask the question about which team's strategies are repeatable in Game 7. That was a good thought and a good thing to discuss.
Yeah, so Sauce Slinger, email dunc'donprime@gmail.com. And I'm gonna pick, much as I want to reward a deal for reminding me that Holmes is on the Washington Wizards now, we'll go with Troot, who has been a longtime commenter. So we appreciate you, Troot. Email dunc'donprime@gmail.com. Get your free year of Dunc'd On Prime. And we'll thank you so much for joining us. Catch you tomorrow. So long.